An unknown number sent me a video my husband proposing to a young woman by the sea. He told me he was on a business trip. I silently typed one word. An hour later, 77 missed calls from my husband. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say you never really know someone until something breaks. I used to roll my eyes at that. I was 38 years old, a marketing director at a mid-sized firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I'd been married to Daniel for 11 years. 11 years! I thought I knew every crease in his face, every habit, every lie he'd ever told, which, as far as I knew, were small ones, the kind every married couple trades. I already ate. Traffic was bad, I'm fine. I thought that was the full catalog. I was wrong. Our house was a colonial on Meadowbrook Drive, the kind of house you spend your 30s working toward and your 40s trying to fill with meaning. We had 2 dogs, a mortgage, a shared Netflix password, and a Thursday night habit of ordering Thai food and arguing mildly about what to watch. We didn't have children. That had been a slow, private grief we'd eventually made peace with. Or so I believed. Daniel worked in corporate logistics, traveled maybe 6 or 7 times a year, always for 3 or 4 days at a stretch. I never questioned it. Why would I? He always called. He always came home smelling like hotel soap and carrying some small apologetic gift. A scented candle, a box of regional chocolates, once a snow globe from Denver that I kept on my desk because it made me laugh. Looking back now, I can identify the first crack in the foundation with embarrassing precision. It was February, 7 months before the video. He started going to the gym at 6 in the morning. That sounds like nothing. People change their routines. But Daniel had never been a morning person. Not in 11 years, not once. I teased him about it. He smiled and said he was getting serious about his health. He lost 14 pounds over 3 months. His shirts started fitting differently. He bought new ones, nicer ones, slimmer cuts. He began wearing cologne on days he wasn't going anywhere in particular. I noticed. Of course I noticed. But I told myself a comfortable story. Midlife, self-improvement, maybe a little vanity. Isn't that what women are always told? Don't be paranoid. Don't be controlling. Trust your husband. I trusted him. Then came the phone. Daniel had always been relaxed about his phone. Left it on the kitchen counter, never flinched when I walked by while he was texting. Starting in March, the phone went everywhere with him. To the bathroom, to the garage, face down on the nightstand. I noticed the pattern before I let myself name it. One evening, I reached across him to grab my water glass, and his hand shot out and flipped the screen before I could see it. It was reflexive, automatic. He laughed it off. Work stuff, sensitive contracts. And I laughed too, and neither of us mentioned it again. But something had shifted in me. Something quiet and cold like a stone dropped into still water. The business trips became slightly more frequent. An extra one in April. Another in June. Always plausible explanations. A conference, a client in Atlanta, a supply chain issue in Miami. I checked nothing. I was not by nature a suspicious woman. I had built my self-image partly around being the kind of wife who didn't snoop, who didn't make scenes, who was reasonable. Looking back, I think that self-image nearly destroyed me. The video arrived on a Tuesday in September at 11:14 in the morning. I was at my desk, eating a salad I wasn't hungry for, reviewing a campaign proposal. My personal phone buzzed. Unknown number. No message, just a video file, 22 seconds long. I almost didn't open it. I thought it was spam. I opened it. The footage was shaky, shot from a distance, but clear enough. A beach. I didn't recognize it immediately. Somewhere with white sand and calm blue water. And Daniel, my husband, in a white linen shirt I had never seen, kneeling on the sand in front of a young woman with long blonde hair. She was laughing and crying at the same time, her hands over her mouth. He was holding up a ring box. I watched it 3 times. 4, 5. He had told me he was in Columbus, a 3-day logistics conference. He had called me the night before and asked if I'd remembered to give the dogs their flea medication. I sat very still at my desk for a long time. My salad sat untouched. The office noise continued around me. Keyboards, a printer, someone laughing in the hallway. The ordinary world proceeding without interruption. Then I opened my messages. I found Daniel's name and I typed one word: smile. I put the phone face down on my desk and went back to the proposal. Within an hour, I had 77 missed calls. I didn't answer a single one. I let the phone buzz against my desk like a dying insect, and I finished reading the proposal and I sent 3 emails. And at 12:45, I walked to the break room and poured myself a coffee I didn't taste. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I had expected shaking, tears, some physical signal that my life had just folded in half. But there was nothing like that. Just a strange, pressurized stillness, like the silence before a storm system moves in. By the time I drove home that evening, Daniel's calls had stopped. There were also 4 text messages. The first said, "We need to talk." The second said, "Please just pick up." The third said, "It's not what it looks like," which, even in that moment, struck me as an almost insultingly lazy thing to say about a video of a man proposing to someone. The fourth said, "I love you. Please call me." I read all 4 in my driveway, sitting in the car with the engine off, and I felt something clarify inside me. Not rage, not yet, something colder. More useful. I went inside, fed the dogs, and opened my laptop. The first thing I did was make a list, not an emotional list, a practical one. Assets: the house, jointly owned, purchased in 2019 for $487,000, current estimated value approximately $610,000. 2 cars, his a leased BMW, mine a paid-off Honda, joint savings account, my 401k, his pension plan through the company, the investment portfolio we'd built slowly over the last 8 years. I wrote it all down in a spreadsheet with the calm efficiency of someone inventorying a warehouse. Then I made a second list. Evidence. What I had, the video, saved to my phone and immediately airdropped to my laptop and emailed to my personal backup address. 22 seconds of Daniel kneeling on a beach with a ring. I noted the date, time, and the unknown number that had sent it. I screenshotted his 4 text messages. I wrote down the details of the trip he'd claimed. Columbus, the hotel name he'd mentioned, Marriott downtown, the conference he'd named Midwest Supply Chain Summit. That night, after the dogs were asleep and the house was quiet, I Googled the conference. It didn't exist. There was no Midwest Supply Chain Summit in Columbus in September. I cross-checked 3 different sites. Nothing. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at the kitchen table and let myself feel it for exactly 20 minutes. The humiliation, the retroactive inventory of every business trip, every late text, every new shirt and early morning. The specific, nauseating realization that he had been planning to propose to someone else while still legally married to me, which meant he had been planning a future that required my erasure. I wasn't a wife he had fallen out of love with. I was an obstacle. 20 minutes, then I closed that door and started thinking. Here is what I knew about myself. I was not going to cry in a lawyer's office. I was not going to send a furious text at midnight. I was not going to call his mother or post anything on social media or show up wherever he was. All of those options had one thing in common. They were emotional, and emotional meant reactive, and reactive meant losing the advantage. I had exactly one advantage. Daniel didn't know what I knew about what I was doing, and I intended to keep it that way. The plan that formed over the next 2 hours was simple, logical, and ruthless in its patience. Step 1. Consult a family law attorney before Daniel returned home. Not to file anything yet, just to understand the legal landscape. What did marital infidelity mean for asset division in North Carolina? What records could I legally access? What should I not touch, not say, not do that could compromise my position later? Step 2. Document everything. Continue gathering evidence quietly. The video was powerful, but a good attorney would tell me what else I needed. Step 3. Do not change my behavior. When Daniel came home, I would be normal, calm, unbothered. I would let him think his panic calls had worked, that I was confused, that I wanted to talk it through. I would give him enough rope. Step 4, protect the finances. Without moving anything that could be flagged, I needed to understand exactly what existed and where. I closed the laptop at midnight. Daniel texted one more time. I'm coming home tomorrow. Please be there. I set the phone on charge, took the dogs upstairs, and slept better than I had in months. The attorney's name was Margaret Holloway, and she came recommended by a colleague at work whose divorce 3 years earlier had been, in that colleague's words, surgical. I called her office at 8 a.m. the morning after the video. I got an appointment for that same afternoon. A cancellation slot, 50 minutes, $300 consultation fee. Her office was on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, tasteful and calm, the kind of space designed to make people feel that chaos could be organized. Margaret herself was in her early 50s, silver-haired with the composed energy of someone who had heard every version of every story and remained unshockable. I liked her immediately. I told her everything in order. I showed her the video, the text messages, my 2 spreadsheets. She took notes without interrupting. When I finished, she looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "You haven't responded to him since the one-word text?" "No." She almost smiled. "Good. Keep it that way until we talk again." North Carolina, she explained, is an at-fault divorce state, one of the few remaining. This meant that documented adultery was legally relevant to the proceedings, not just emotionally. It could affect the division of assets, and critically, Daniel could potentially face what the state calls alienation of affection liability. It was an old statute, rarely applied, but not toothless. She told me what to document, how to document it, and what not to do. Don't access his email or phone without consent. Don't move money without documentation. Don't discuss the case on social media or with mutual friends. "Are you sure you want to proceed?" she asked, not with doubt, just with the professional duty to ask. "I've never been more sure of anything," I said, and I meant it. I paid her fee in cash, a deliberate decision, and drove home 40 minutes before Daniel's flight was due to land. He walked in at 6:30 p.m. with his roller bag and a bouquet of grocery store flowers that made me feel something between pity and contempt. He looked terrible, pale, unshaven, the specific haggard appearance of a man who had spent 24 hours terrified of his own choices. He said my name like a question. "Hi," I said. "I was at the stove making pasta. Hungry?" The confusion on his face was almost worth the previous 24 hours. He had prepared, I could see, for tears or screaming or cold silence. He hadn't prepared for pasta. We sat across from each other and he talked for a long time. The story came out in pieces, contradicting itself, rearranging itself, trying on different shapes. Britt, he called her Britt, was someone he'd met 18 months ago at an actual conference in Phoenix. It had started as nothing. It just happened. He hadn't meant to fall in love. He hadn't planned the proposal. It had been impulsive. He was confused. He still loved me. He was so sorry. I listened. I asked calm, quiet questions, the kind that sounded like a wife trying to understand, and were actually a woman gathering testimony. How long had they been seeing each other? 18 months. Had she known about me? A pause. She knew I was married. Where were you when you proposed? Destin, Florida, her idea. She'd rented a beach house. I filed every answer. I ended it, he said finally. When you sent that one word, I called her and ended it. We're done. I want to fix our marriage. I want to fix us. I looked at him across the table. 11 years of shared life. 2 dogs, a snow globe from Denver, 1,000 Thursday nights. And underneath all of it, 18 months of lies so comfortable he'd almost built a second future on top of them. "Okay," I said. "I need some time to process. Let's just be calm this week." He exhaled with visible relief. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that while he'd been on his flight, I had forwarded the video to Margaret. Margaret had forwarded it to a private investigator she worked with regularly, a woman named Carol Lewis, who had already begun pulling records. Flight manifests were public information under certain conditions. Hotel receipts, if paid on a joint credit card, were accessible to both account holders. Daniel had been sloppy because he had never imagined he'd need to be careful. The first document Carol sent me arrived 3 days later, a credit card statement showing 18 hotel charges in 12 months across 7 cities, every one of them on trips I had known about and believed. $62,000. That was what his double life had cost, charged partly to accounts that held our shared money. That was the moment I stopped calling it a marriage. I started calling it a case. Margaret filed the initial separation papers on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the video. I had not told Daniel they were coming. I had been, as promised, calm. Attentive enough to seem like a woman working through her pain privately. Distant enough that he'd started walking on eggshells. He'd stopped going to the gym at 6. He'd started coming home early. He'd made dinner twice. He was performing the role of a reformed man with the desperation of someone who knows the audience is unconvinced. The process server reached him at his office at 10:15 a.m. His assistant called me 12 minutes later. "Daniel asked me to let you know he's on his way home." In the careful tone of someone who had been given a script and didn't understand it. I thanked her and sat down. He came through the front door 40 minutes later with a face I had never seen before. Not remorse this time. Something harder. You filed, he said. I did. Without telling me. You didn't tell me about Destin. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, and I watched him decide who he was going to be. The man who apologized chose poorly. Margaret Holloway, he said, with a different voice, quieter, more deliberate. I know who she is. She's a pit bull, Sarah. This is going to be a war. Okay, I said. You're going to blow up everything we built. You built a parallel life on top of what we built. I'm just responding to the foundation you laid. That was when his phone rang. He looked at the screen and stepped outside to answer it. I stood in the kitchen and waited. When he came back in, something had shifted again. He was steadier, which made me more alert, not less. Britt's father is a real estate attorney in Tampa, he said. He's going to help her understand her options. I almost laughed. Her options for what, Daniel? She wasn't married to you. She was promised something. She has texts, emails. She's prepared to submit them as evidence that the affair was mutual and sustained, which under North Carolina law means... I know what it means. I kept my voice level. My attorney is familiar with the statute. He moved closer, and for the first time I felt a flicker of something. Not fear exactly, more like the physical awareness of how high the stakes had become. Sarah, I'm asking you to stop this. We can go to counseling. We can negotiate privately without courts, without attorneys making $400 an hour off our misery. But if you push this, Britt's father will make sure this gets complicated. Daniel stared at me. Then he left. He went to stay, I learned later, with a college friend in Raleigh. His exit was sudden and poorly packed. He left half his clothes, his good watch, the charger for his laptop. The dogs didn't seem to notice. I did. The following 3 days were quiet in the way that eye of the storm quiet feels different from ordinary quiet. Carol confirmed that Britt's father, one Gerald Marsh, had indeed contacted a colleague in the Charlotte legal community to inquire about cross-jurisdictional options. Margaret received a letter that was carefully worded but unmistakably a pressure tactic, suggesting that if I withdrew my adultery claim, the matter could be settled discreetly without further embarrassment to all parties. Margaret's response was 4 sentences long and cost Gerald Marsh nothing to understand. I took that Friday and the weekend entirely for myself. I drove 3 hours to Asheville, checked into a small inn near the river, and spent 2 days doing nothing that required any strategy at all. I walked. I ate well. I read a novel I'd been meaning to read for 2 years. I called my sister and talked for 2 hours without crying more than once. By Sunday night, sitting on the inn's small porch with a glass of wine and the sound of the French Broad River below, I realized I felt something I hadn't expected. Ready. Not angry, not righteous, not even sad. Just very, very ready. I came back from Asheville on Monday morning and found a gift basket on my front porch. High-end, professionally arranged, wine, artisan crackers, a small jar of truffle honey, a handwritten card. The card read, Sarah. I know this is painful for all of us. I'd love to talk, woman to woman. I think we might understand each other better than you'd expect. Britt. I stood on the porch in the early September light and looked at the basket for a long moment. The audacity of it was almost artistic. I took a photo of the basket and the card for my records, then left the basket on the porch. I called Margaret. She made contact, I said. Of course she did, said Margaret. What did it say? I read her the card, a pause. Leave it there. Don't touch it, don't return it, don't respond. I'll note the date and time of the contact attempt. If she reaches out again, same protocol. What is she trying to accomplish? Best case, from her perspective, she wants to assess you, see if you're volatile, if you can be managed, if there's an opening for a negotiated retreat that benefits Daniel. She's not acting alone. That basket came from a conversation with Daniel and probably with her father. I thought about that. A 26-year-old woman. I knew her age from Carol's background report, her full name, her social media, her job as an event coordinator in Tampa, sending a truffle honey basket to the wife of the man she'd been sleeping with for 18 months as a strategic opening move. It would have been darkly funny if it weren't also clarifying. I was not dealing with a naive girl who hadn't understood what she'd walked into. I was dealing with someone who had made choices and was now protecting her investment. The attempted contact from Britt was the push I needed to do something I had been postponing. Tell people. I don't mean broadcast it. I mean the small, essential circle. The people whose knowledge would become structural support rather than social drama. I started with my sister, Rachel, who I'd partially told in Asheville, but now told fully. Rachel was a forensic accountant in Seattle, methodical and unshockable, and her first response was, "Send me all the financial documents. I'll look at them independently." I did. Then I told my closest friend, Deanna, who had known Daniel for 9 years, and whose reaction was a silence so long I thought the call had dropped. Then, "I need you to come over." I did that evening, and we sat in her kitchen until midnight, and she said almost nothing that wasn't useful. And then, and this was the one I'd been most uncertain about, I told my manager at work, not the personal details, but enough. I was going through a divorce. It might create some unpredictability in my schedule. I wanted him to know before he wondered. He said, without hesitation, "Take whatever you need. Your project load stays manageable." I thanked him and felt the specific relief of not carrying something alone. By the end of that week, I had 3 people actively in my corner who understood the full picture. Deanna, who checked in daily, Rachel, who was building a parallel financial analysis, Margaret, who was constructing a legal narrative, and Carol, still quietly working. Daniel, meanwhile, was doing what people do when their careful plans begin to unravel. He was overcorrecting. He texted every few days, sometimes pleading, sometimes practical. When should I get the rest of my things? Once, memorably, a long and rambling message at 1 a.m. that appeared to have been written after several drinks, full of grievances I hadn't known he had, about feeling suffocated and invisible in our marriage. I read it once and forwarded it to Margaret with a note. For the file. Was it painful? Of course. I won't pretend it wasn't. There were moments, usually early in the morning, before full consciousness restored my armor, when the grief hit without warning, the specific sorrow of a life being disassembled not because it had failed naturally, but because it had been betrayed. 11 years, I had loved him honestly, but grief and purpose can coexist. I had learned that somewhere in the preceding weeks, in the space between Asheville and the gift basket on my porch, between Margaret's legal letters and Rachel's spreadsheets, I was mourning and I was moving, both things simultaneously. The basket was still on the porch when the FedEx driver raised an eyebrow at it on Thursday. I told him it was a donation. They came on a Saturday. I was in the backyard with the dogs when I heard the doorbell. Two figures visible through the frosted glass of the front panel. I recognized the shape of one of them. Daniel. The other was shorter, female. I stood for a moment in the yard, feeling something cool and focused settle over me. Then I walked through the house and opened the door. Britt Marsh was prettier in person than in her social media photos. Late 20s, sun blonde with a studied pleasantness that I recognized immediately as rehearsed. She was dressed carefully, nothing provocative, a soft blouse, minimal jewelry, the visual language of reasonable and apologetic. Daniel stood half a step behind her, which told me everything about who had arranged this visit. "Sarah," he said, "can we come in?" I looked at him, then at her, then back at him. "No," I said, "but I'll stand here for a few minutes." Britt spoke first, which I suspected had also been planned. Her voice was measured, warm, the voice of someone who had practiced. She was sorry, she said. Truly. She hadn't intended for things to go this way. She'd been young and she'd made choices she regretted. She wanted me to know there was no hostility on her part. She and Daniel were prepared to be reasonable. They weren't trying to take anything from me. They just wanted to move forward, all of them, with minimal damage. "We think," Daniel said, "that pursuing the at-fault claim is going to hurt both of us more than it helps. Financially, emotionally. We've talked to Gerald and—" "You've talked to her father about my legal strategy," I said. "We've talked about what a reasonable resolution looks like." "And what does it look like?" Britt leaned forward slightly. "An equitable split. Private mediation instead of court. No adultery claim on the record. That protects you too, Sarah. You don't want this story public either." I looked at her with what I hoped was polite curiosity. The way you look at something mildly interesting that you're not going to touch. "I want to make sure I understand. You're asking me to withdraw a legally supported claim, accept a private mediation process controlled by terms you've already discussed with your father, and do this in order to protect me." She maintained the warmth. "We think it's better for everyone. You've been sleeping with my husband for 18 months, I said pleasantly. You accepted a marriage proposal from a man who was legally married. And now you're standing on my porch explaining what's better for me." The warmth flickered. Not gone. She was disciplined. But the temperature behind it dropped by several degrees. That's not a productive framing. It's the accurate one. Daniel stepped forward slightly. "Sarah, be realistic. Gerald has resources and he's prepared to use them. Dragging this through court is going to be expensive and public, and it's going to take years. Is that really what you want? You can walk away with a fair settlement now, without the circus." And there it was. The threat dressed up as advice. Gerald's resources. The implied cost of refusing. The word circus, designed to make me feel like the problem. I had known this moment was coming. I had rehearsed it, not with scripts, but with clarity, understanding exactly what I would and wouldn't accept, and why. "I appreciate you coming in person," I said. "It tells me a lot. Margaret will be in touch about scheduling." "Sarah, I'd like you to leave my property now," I said, and I held the door edge and waited. Britt's composure broke for just one moment. A flash of something real beneath the rehearsed warmth, something that looked like fury. Then she collected herself, touched Daniel's arm, and turned toward the car. Daniel stayed a second longer, looking at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Part plea, part calculation, part something that might have been distantly respect. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Maybe," I said. "Drive safe." I closed the door. I leaned against it in the hallway with the dogs bumping against my legs, and I let myself feel the fear, because it was there, real and sharp. Gerald Marsh was not nobody. Resources were not nothing. A long court process was not nothing. I stood with all of that for 60 seconds, and then something interesting happened. The fear turned into fuel. It clarified the stakes. It confirmed that what I was doing mattered enough for them to drive 3 hours to stop me. If they were this frightened of my case was strong. I called Margaret on Monday morning and said, "Let's move forward with everything." The deposition was scheduled for a Wednesday in November, 4 months after the video. Margaret had requested it. The opposing counsel, a Charlotte attorney hired at Gerald Marsh's direction, a man named Fowler, had resisted and then complied. The session was held in a neutral conference room in a downtown law office, the kind of room that smells of old paper and forced neutrality. Daniel was present with Fowler beside him. A court reporter sat at the end of the table. Margaret sat next to me, and across from us the weight of everything we'd built over 4 months. I had not seen Daniel in 6 weeks. He looked older, or maybe just less assembled. The careful gym-shaped confidence of the spring had given way to something more ragged. He didn't look at me when I came in. The deposition proceeded methodically. Margaret had prepared me so thoroughly that I felt less like a witness than like an architect, watching a building go up exactly as designed. Every question she posed to Daniel had been constructed around what we already knew, so that his answers either confirmed the evidence or created a contradiction the record would reflect. The $62,000. He confirmed the credit card charges. He'd had no choice. They were documented, and characterized them as personal spending he'd intended to repay. Margaret produced the statements with dates precisely matching the hotel bookings Carol had mapped. The paper trail didn't lie, the conference that hadn't existed. Fowler objected to the line of questioning. Margaret waited and continued. Daniel confirmed he had attended no conference in Columbus in September. He'd been in Destin. He'd told me Columbus. Yes, he acknowledged that. Then Margaret introduced the phone records. Carol had obtained, through proper legal channels, 18 months of cell tower data for Daniel's phone, the kind of record that shows not what was said, but where the phone was. It placed him in 7 cities on 7 separate trips. All 7 matched hotel charges on the joint credit card. None of the 7 matched the destinations he had told me. Fowler's objections became more frequent. Daniel's answers became shorter. The confident man who had stood on my porch and used the word realistic had been replaced by someone who was calculating in real time how much he'd underestimated the preparation on the other side of the table. But the real moment, the one I had been waiting for, the one Margaret had engineered with the patience of a chess player who sees 12 moves ahead, came in the final hour. Gerald Marsh, Britt's father, had submitted a supporting declaration claiming that his daughter had been deceived by Daniel, that Daniel had represented himself as separated, imminently divorcing, with his wife's knowledge and tacit consent. The declaration was designed to shift moral and legal weight away from Britt and onto Daniel, reducing her culpability while increasing his. Margaret had predicted this. She introduced a single exhibit, a text message exchange between Daniel and Britt, dated 4 months into the affair, in which Britt wrote, "Does she actually know about us?" And Daniel replied, "She suspects, but she's not going to do anything. You know how she is." And Britt replied, "Good. I just need to know we're protected." The room went very quiet. She had not been deceived. She had asked the question, received the answer, and used it to assess her own protection. The declaration her father had submitted, the declaration that a Tampa real estate attorney had put his professional reputation behind, was contradicted entirely and precisely by his own daughter's text messages. Fowler asked for a recess. During the recess, I sat in the hallway with Margaret, who was making notes with the brisk efficiency of someone entirely unsurprised. "That was the declaration," I said. "That was the declaration," she agreed. He didn't know about those texts. Nobody on their side reviewed the full message thread. They reviewed enough to build their narrative. We reviewed everything. She looked up at me. "Are you all right?" I thought about it honestly. The fluorescent hall, the fake fern in the corner, the muffled voices behind the conference room door, Daniel's expression when the exhibit went up, something crumpling at the center of it, the careful architecture of his double life exposed under lighting it had never been designed for. "Yes," I said, "I'm all right." When the recess ended and we returned to the table, Daniel's eyes finally found mine. I held them for a moment. No anger, no satisfaction, just steadiness. 11 years and one Wednesday morning in November. Then I looked at my notes and we continued. The case settled 5 weeks after the deposition. It was not the settlement Daniel and Gerald Marsh had arrived on my porch to propose. It was not private mediation on their terms, not an equitable split as Britt had defined it, not a quiet resolution designed to minimize inconvenience to the people who had caused the problem. It was something else entirely. The kind of outcome that happens when one side has spent 4 months building a case with precision and patience, and the other side has spent 4 months assuming the woman across the table would eventually fold. She didn't fold. North Carolina's family law applied with documented adultery and Rachel's independent financial analysis, confirming the $62,000 in marital funds misappropriated for the affair, produced a result that Fowler had privately advised Daniel to accept before it reached a judge. According to Margaret, who heard it from a colleague, Fowler had told him in plain language, "The record is what it is. You don't want a judge reading these documents aloud in open court." Daniel had taken the advice. Reluctantly, visibly, and too late to change the architecture of what he'd already lost. I received the house, its full value, bought out against Daniel's share of the joint investment portfolio, with an additional offset for the documented marital waste. Rachel's analysis, what Margaret submitted as a financial affidavit, itemized every charge with cross-referenced hotel records, flight data, and restaurant receipts. $62,000 had been spent. $62,000 was reflected in the settlement. Rachel had done the work with the calm thoroughness of someone who finds injustice in financial documents personally offensive, and I will be grateful to her for that for the rest of my life. My 401k remained entirely mine. Daniel's pension, partially accumulated during the marriage, was divided, and my share was significant. The joint savings account, largely untouched through the proceedings, was split with an adjustment for the documented waste. His leased BMW was his problem. My Honda was mine, paid off and uncontested. The legal costs were allocated partially to Daniel by the court's discretion, given the conduct documented in the proceedings. That allocation alone represented a number that made Fowler wince visibly during the final review session, according to Margaret, who described his expression with characteristic understatement as not pleased. Gerald Marsh's declaration was not withdrawn. He hadn't the grace for that. But after the deposition exhibit contradicted it on the record, it carried no practical weight. The move he had calculated as protective cover for his daughter had instead placed his professional credibility alongside a document that directly contradicted it. Britt's text message, "I just need to know we're protected," appeared in the filed record, a precise and permanent rebuttal to a declaration her own father had signed. Records, I should note, are public. I felt nothing particular about that. I had not planned it. I had not wanted it specifically. I had pursued what was mine through legitimate means, and the record reflected what had happened. If the record had consequences for others, those consequences were the natural result of choices they had made freely, with full knowledge of the risks, over 18 months. Daniel called me once 3 months after the settlement. I don't know what he intended to say. He started with my name, his voice carrying that particular tone of a man who has rehearsed an opening and is uncertain about everything after it. I interrupted quietly before he could find his footing. "I wish you well, Daniel," I said. "Please don't call again." I meant the first part. That surprised me even as I said it. The genuine absence of a wish for his suffering. He had caused enormous, deliberate damage to a life we had built together. The law had responded proportionally and without sentiment, and I was done. Not performing done. Not strategically done. Genuinely, completely finished carrying the weight of what he had chosen. He didn't call again. Margaret sent me a bottle of champagne when the final documents were signed. A small one with a note that said simply, "Well done." Carol Liu sent an email that was 3 sentences and entirely professional, which somehow felt like exactly the right register. Rachel flew out from Seattle for a weekend, and we hiked part of the Appalachian Trail in the cold November air and didn't talk about the case much at all. We talked about other things, better things. The way the light hit the ridge in the late afternoon. Plans she had. Plans I was beginning to form. The day the house transfer finalized and Daniel's name came off the deed, I sat in the kitchen. My kitchen, legally and completely and finally, with both dogs warm and heavy on my feet and a cup of coffee growing cold beside me, and I thought about the woman who had opened a 22-second video at her desk on a Tuesday in September and gone very, very still. She'd been terrified. I could admit that now, clearly and without shame. Terrified and humiliated and completely alone with it in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, in an office full of people who had no idea. But she had picked up her phone. She had typed one word, and she had not flinched from a single thing that followed. The first year after the settlement was the quietest of my adult life, in the best sense of that word. I repainted the living room in February. A warm terracotta I had wanted for years, and Daniel had always vetoed in favor of something neutral, something safe, something that wouldn't commit. I painted it myself over a long weekend, badly at first and then with improving technique, and when I finished and stood back and looked at it in the afternoon light, I felt something close to pure satisfaction. A small thing, a real thing. I planted a kitchen garden in the spring, the kind driven by more enthusiasm than expertise. Tomatoes that came in all at once and overwhelmed me. Basil I couldn't use fast enough. One ambitious row of bell peppers that mostly did what they wanted. I gave bags of tomatoes to Deanna and to the neighbors on the left, a retired couple named the Garcias, who had never once said anything about the process servers or the lawyer's car in the driveway, for which I was grateful in a way I couldn't quite articulate. I bought a good armchair for the corner of the bedroom, a wide one with an ottoman, and put a good lamp beside it and spent entire Sunday mornings reading without checking the time or feeling that I should be doing something else. That freedom, the permission to simply be still without managing anyone else's comfort, was newer than it should have been, and I didn't take it for granted. The dogs thrived. Hank, the older one, had developed a late-life philosophy about afternoon sun on the porch that I found deeply reasonable and encouraged. Maisie, the younger, had decided that the kitchen garden was her personal project and had to be gently discouraged from it on a daily basis. Both of them were, in their uncomplicated way, the best company I had. At work, something shifted that I hadn't anticipated. The quiet competence I'd carried through the previous 9 months, the managing of significant complexity without visible distress, the showing up, the delivering, had been observed by people who noticed such things. In March, I was offered a senior VP position that I would have hesitated over before, would have questioned my readiness for, would have deferred on for another year out of some habitual caution I'd never examined. I said yes without hesitation and started the following Monday. The work was demanding and interesting, and mine in a way that felt different from before, as though I had renegotiated my own terms with it. I started seeing a therapist in January, Dr. Amara Collins, referred by my physician, direct and thoughtful and not at all interested in offering easy comfort. We talked about the marriage and the betrayal and the specific layered grief of discovering that a life you'd believed in had been quietly hollowed out from underneath. But we also talked, and this was the part I hadn't expected, about who I had been before the marriage. The choices I'd made that were entirely mine, the self-image I'd built around being reasonable, being unbothered, trusting without verification. Not to assign blame where it didn't belong, but to understand the full architecture. It was the most honest conversation I'd had in years, and I went back every 2 weeks without fail. By summer, I was genuinely happy. Not performed, not curated, not the version of recovery you post about. The quiet, load-bearing kind that requires no documentation. Dinner with Deanna every other week. Seattle in August with Rachel. Hiking in the cool Pacific air. Eating at a small restaurant she loved. Talking about her life and my life. And the general project of being women in our 40s, with more clarity than we'd had in our 30s. The ceramics class was a whim that became a standing commitment. I was not talented. I made 3 lopsided bowls and a mug with an uneven handle, and I kept all of them, arranged on the kitchen windowsill where the morning light hit them, and I liked them more than any object in the house that had been chosen jointly. Daniel, I heard through peripheral channels, the kind of information that arrives without being sought. Through Deanna, through a mutual colleague, through the small connective tissue of shared communities, was living in the Raleigh rental on a budget significantly reduced by legal fees. He was still at the same company at reduced seniority following a restructuring that had, by most accounts, not been entirely coincidental in its timing. He and Britt were still together in the functional sense of that word, though no second engagement had been announced, and what Deanna described as the shine appeared to have left the arrangement sometime around the deposition. Britt had relocated to Atlanta, working at a smaller firm. The Tampa promotion had not been the last professional consequence. There had been a general deterioration in the relationship with her previous employer that had preceded her resignation by several uncomfortable months. Her social media presence had gone quiet, then private, then largely dormant. Gerald Marsh had not, as far as anyone could determine, emerged professionally enhanced from his involvement in the Charlotte proceedings. I did not seek any of this out. I received it the way you receive weather reports for places you no longer live, with mild, dispassionate interest, and then you move on. What I felt when I let myself sit with it was not satisfaction at their difficulty, but something more like the quiet recognition of physics. What you set in motion tends to continue in motion. The choices made over 18 months had trajectories. The trajectories had arrived at destinations. That was all. On the 1-year anniversary of the settlement, I drove to Asheville. The same inn, the same porch, the same river running fast and cold below. I sat with a glass of wine and the sound of the water and the early November dark coming in over the mountains, and I thought about very little in particular. I was 40 years old. The terracotta walls were waiting at home. There was basil on the counter. The dogs needed their morning walk. I finished the wine, went inside, and slept without dreaming. I told this story